On the 4th of November, 1999, Brianna Mitchell's life ended in a way that no one in Fairfield, Alabama could have ever imagined. It was a chilly autumn evening when the news broke. A body had been found in the woods surrounding the Mitchell estate. The once peaceful town was shaken to its core, and the perfect image of Brianna Mitchell began to crumble. Just days before her death, Brianna had performed in what would be her final ballet. The townspeople who attended the show had no idea they were witnessing the last moments of a woman whose life would soon be cut short in the most tragic way. Now, as the investigation began, the town was left reeling, desperate to uncover the truth behind the shocking murder. But to understand how it all came to this, we must go back to the beginning, to a time when Brianna Mitchell was the epitome of grace and elegance. At 35, Brianna was the darling of Fairfield. Her beauty, combined with her talent as a ballet dancer, had made her a beloved figure in the community. The town's elite often flocked to the local theater whenever Brianna performed, entranced by her ethereal presence on stage. To everyone around her, she was living the dream, a devoted wife, the perfect housewife, a loving mother, and a successful artist. Her husband, Silas Mitchell, was a towering figure in the community. At 45, he had built an empire in real estate, becoming one of the wealthiest and most influential men in the state. His firm, Mitchell & Company, had developed some of the most luxurious properties in the region, including the grand estate they lived in, a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of town, surrounded by meticulously landscaped gardens and private woods. Silas was everything a successful man should be: strong, charismatic, and commanding. Known for his sharp business acumen and his ability to close deals that others deemed impossible, his imposing figure, standing at 6 4 with broad shoulders and a deep, resonant voice, made him the kind of man who naturally dominated any room he entered. Yet, despite his formidable exterior, those close to him knew him as a loving father to their 2 children, Emily, aged 10, and Lucas, aged 8, and a devoted husband to Brianna. To the outside world, the Mitchells had it all. They were the picture-perfect family, wealthy, beautiful, and deeply in love. Brianna's ballet career was thriving, with performances that often took her to different parts of the country, allowing her to shine under the spotlight she so adored. Meanwhile, Silas's business ventures were growing exponentially, solidifying their status as one of the most powerful families in the region. But beneath this veneer of perfection lay a hidden truth, a truth that, once revealed, would shatter their lives and the lives of those around them. Father Sean McAllister had been the parish priest at Holy Trinity Church for over 2 decades. In his early 50s, with a gentle demeanor and a reassuring smile, Father Sean was beloved by his congregation. His sermons were always filled with wisdom, and his presence brought comfort to those in need. He had a way of making people feel at ease, drawing out their deepest fears and helping them find solace. But Father Sean was not the man he appeared to be. Decades earlier, before he had taken on his role at Holy Trinity, he had lived a different life in a different town under a different name. He had been involved in a scandal that the church had quietly covered up. A young woman had died under suspicious circumstances, and while the details were murky, there were those who believed that Father Sean had played a role in her death. The church, eager to avoid any public scandal, had quickly relocated him to Fairfield, giving him a new identity and a fresh start. In Fairfield, Father Sean had rebuilt his life and become a trusted advisor to many, including the Mitchell family. Silas, who had grown up attending Holy Trinity, had always respected Father Sean and often invited him to family gatherings. The priest had become a close friend of the family, a confidant, and a spiritual guide. Brianna, who had been raised in a devout Catholic household, had always felt a deep connection to the church. After marrying Silas and moving to Fairfield, she had quickly formed a bond with Father Sean. She often turned to him for guidance, sharing her struggles and doubts with him during confession or after Sunday Mass. Over time, these conversations became more frequent, more personal, and more intimate. Though outwardly perfect, Brianna's life was not without its challenges. The pressures of maintaining her public image, the demands of her ballet career, and the growing distance between her and Silas had taken their toll. Silas's business required him to travel frequently, and when he was home, he was often preoccupied with work. Brianna began to feel isolated, lonely, and trapped in a life that, while glamorous, lacked the emotional connection she craved. It was during one of these lonely moments that Brianna found herself turning to Father Sean for comfort. What began as a simple conversation soon evolved into something much more. Father Sean listened to her in a way that Silas never did. He made her feel seen, understood, and valued. As their bond deepened, the boundaries between priest and parishioner began to blur. But if they had known the dark consequences their affair would unleash, they might have never crossed that line. The first time Brianna and Father Sean crossed the line was late one evening after a particularly emotional confession. Brianna had been performing in a series of demanding ballet shows, and the physical and emotional strain had left her feeling vulnerable. After her confession, Father Sean had offered to walk her to her car. The church was quiet, the evening air cool and crisp. As they stood by her car, their eyes met, and in that moment the unspoken tension between them became undeniable. It started with a kiss, tentative at first, but quickly growing more passionate. Brianna knew it was wrong, but the thrill of it, the forbidden nature of their actions, only fueled her desire for Father Sean. The kiss awakened something dark within him, something he had buried deep inside after the events of his past. The guilt was immediate, but so was the overwhelming urge to possess her, to claim her as his own. From that moment on, their affair intensified. They found ways to be together in secret, meeting in secluded spots in the church after hours, or in Brianna's car parked in isolated areas. Brianna began to create elaborate lies to cover up her absences, telling Silas that she had late-night rehearsals, or that she was staying at a friend's house to rest before a big performance. During her ballet tours, Brianna would often lie about her whereabouts. Instead of performing in distant cities, she would check into hotels with Father Sean, spending entire nights with him wrapped in the secrecy and thrill of their forbidden love. The danger of being caught only added to the excitement, making each encounter more intense than the last. But as the affair continued, Father Sean's behavior began to change. He became increasingly possessive, demanding more of Brianna's time and attention. He would call her at all hours, insisting that she meet him, even if it meant canceling plans with her family. He started to resent Silas, seeing him as an obstacle to his happiness, a rival who needed to be removed from the picture. Brianna began to notice this change in Father Sean. He was no longer the gentle, caring priest she had known. Instead, he became more controlling, more demanding, and at times frighteningly aggressive. During one heated argument in a hotel room, he had grabbed her by the wrist so hard that it left bruises. Although he had apologized profusely afterward, Brianna couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in the pit of her stomach. Despite her growing fear, Brianna couldn't bring herself to end the affair. She was trapped, ensnared by her own desires and by the dark charisma of Father Sean. She knew she was playing with fire, but she was too far gone to turn back. Silas Mitchell prided himself on being in control. In his business dealings, he was always the one calling the shots, always the one with the upper hand. He had built his empire from the ground up, and nothing and no one had ever stood in his way. But when it came to his marriage, Silas started to sense that something was off. Brianna had become distant, often lost in thought, and there were too many unexplained absences. She was always coming up with reasons to be away: extra rehearsals, last-minute performances, overnight stays with friends. At first, Silas dismissed it as part of her demanding career, but as the weeks turned into months, his suspicions grew. Silas wasn't the kind of man to sit idly by while his life spun out of control. He decided to take matters into his own hands. Using his connections, he hired a private investigator to follow Brianna during one of her supposed ballet tours. The investigator, a discreet and experienced professional, was instructed to report back with any findings, no matter how minor. It didn't take long for the investigator to uncover the truth. Brianna had checked into a hotel on the outskirts of town not alone, but with Father Sean. The investigator provided photos, grainy images taken from a distance. He needed a plan, a way to catch them in the act, to make them face the consequences of their betrayal. As Silas carefully laid his plans, Brianna found herself sinking deeper into the web of lies she had created. Each day it became harder to maintain the facade of a happy wife and devoted mother. The guilt gnawed at her, but the fear of losing Father Sean, the one person who seemed to understand her, kept her going. Father Sean, on the other hand, was becoming increasingly unhinged. The pressure of keeping their affair a secret, combined with his own guilt and dark urges, began to wear on him. He became more erratic, more desperate to hold on to Brianna, fearing that she might leave him, or worse, expose their affair. He started to push Brianna further, insisting that she make a choice between him and Silas. He wanted her all to himself, and the thought of her continuing to live with Silas, even as a charade, drove him mad. Brianna, caught between her loyalty to her family and her passion for Father Sean, found herself in an impossible situation. She couldn't imagine leaving her children or her comfortable life with Silas, but the thought of losing Father Sean terrified her. She was trapped in a cycle of deceit, and the walls were closing in. One night, after a particularly heated argument with Father Sean, Brianna drove home in tears. She felt lost, confused, and utterly alone. As she pulled into the driveway, she saw that Silas's car was already there. He had come home early from his business trip. Her heart sank, and a wave of panic washed over her. She quickly wiped her tears, trying to compose herself before entering the house. But Silas had already noticed the change in her. He saw the way her hands trembled as she set down her keys, the redness in her eyes that she tried to hide. He said nothing, but his silence was more telling than any words. He watched her closely, his mind already turning over the possibilities, the strategies he would need to employ to bring this deception to an end. Silas's opportunity came sooner than he had anticipated. The following weekend, Brianna told him she had a last-minute rehearsal in the city, followed by an overnight stay with a fellow dancer. Silas feigned understanding and even kissed her goodbye with a warmth that made Brianna's heart ache with guilt. But as soon as she was out of sight, Silas put his plan into action. He had already contacted the private investigator, instructing him to follow Brianna again. This time, however, Silas decided to take matters into his own hands. He followed the investigator's car at a distance, driving with the calm determination of a man who knew he was about to exact his revenge. Brianna, oblivious to the danger she was in, drove to a remote hotel on the outskirts of town where she had arranged to meet Father Sean. She parked her car around the back, away from prying eyes, and hurried inside. The thrill of seeing him, the illicit nature of their relationship, still sent a shiver down her spine, despite the growing dread that this couldn't last forever. Father Sean was already in the room when she arrived. He greeted her with a desperate kiss, his hands shaking slightly as they held her close. He could sense the tension in her, the way her body stiffened in his embrace. They both knew they were nearing the breaking point, but neither could find the strength to walk away. As they lay together in the bed, tangled in the sheets and in their emotions, Silas arrived at the hotel. He parked his car quietly, making sure it was hidden from view, and entered through a side door. The investigator had already provided him with the room number, and Silas moved through the hallway with the silent precision of a hunter, closing in on his prey. The door to the hotel room was slightly ajar, and as Silas approached, he could hear the murmur of voices from within. His heart pounded in his chest, not with fear, but with the cold, calculated rage of a man who knew he had been wronged. He reached for the golf club he had brought with him from the car, his grip tightening on the handle. Inside the room, Brianna and Father Sean were lost in their own world, unaware of the storm about to descend upon them. They spoke in hushed tones, their words filled with the tension of their situation. Father Sean was pressing her again, demanding that she leave Silas. Before Brianna could respond, the door burst open with a force that made them both jump. Silas stood in the doorway, his face a mask of controlled fury, the golf club raised menacingly in his hand. Brianna's heart stopped as she looked at him, the color draining from her face. Father Sean instinctively moved to protect her, but the sight of Silas's towering figure froze him in place. Without a word, Silas advanced on them, the golf club swinging with brutal precision. The first blow struck Father Sean across the head, the sickening crack echoing through the room as the priest crumpled to the floor. Blood pooled beneath him, spreading across the carpet like a dark red stain. Brianna screamed, but Silas was beyond reason. He turned on her, his eyes wild with rage. "How could you?" he spat, his voice trembling with the weight of his betrayal. "How could you do this to us, to our family?" Brianna tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go. Silas raised the club again, and before she could utter another word, it came crashing down. The pain was blinding, and the world around her dissolved into darkness. As she fell beside Father Sean, the life drained from her body. The police were called to the hotel by the manager, who had heard the commotion and feared the worst. When they arrived, they found Silas sitting on the floor between the two bodies, the bloodied golf club resting beside him. He didn't resist as they handcuffed him, his eyes glazed over as if he were in a trance. The crime scene was gruesome blood spattered across the walls and floor, the bodies of Brianna and Father Sean lying side by side, their faces contorted in the final moments of their lives. The investigators carefully documented everything, taking photos, collecting evidence, and trying to piece together the events that had led to this tragic end. Silas was taken into custody without incident. He made no attempt to explain himself, offering no defense or excuse for what he had done. The only words he spoke were to ask for his children a request that was met with silence. The news of the murder spread quickly through Fairfield, shocking the small community to its core. The story of Brianna Mitchell, the beloved ballet dancer, and her illicit affair with the town's priest was the kind of scandal that no one could have imagined. The media descended on the town, eager for every sordid detail, and the once idyllic image of the Mitchell family was shattered beyond repair. Silas's trial was a media circus from the start. Reporters packed the courtroom every day, cameras flashing as they captured every moment of the proceedings. The prosecution portrayed Silas as a cold-blooded killer, a man who had brutally murdered his wife and her lover in a fit of jealous rage. They painted a picture of a controlling husband who couldn't bear the thought of his wife being with another man. But Silas's defense team had a different strategy. They argued that Silas had been pushed to the brink, that he had acted in a moment of temporary insanity after discovering the ultimate betrayal. They highlighted the fact that Silas had been a loving husband and father, a respected member of the community who had never shown any signs of violence before this tragic event. The defense also delved into Father Sean's past, bringing to light the scandal that had been covered up by the church all those years ago. They argued that Father Sean had manipulated Brianna, taking advantage of her vulnerability and leading her into a destructive affair. They presented evidence of the priest's controlling behavior, his dark past, and his involvement in the death of the young woman decades earlier. The trial was long and emotionally charged. Witnesses were called, including the private investigator who had uncovered the affair, and experts testified about the psychological effects of betrayal and infidelity. The jury was shown photos of the crime scene, and they listened to hours of testimony about the events leading up to that fateful night. As the trial dragged on, the public's perception of Silas began to shift. While many still saw him as a murderer, others began to sympathize with him, seeing him as a man who had been driven to madness by the betrayal of those closest to him. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury finally reached a verdict. The courtroom was packed as the foreman stood to deliver their decision. The tension was palpable, the air thick with anticipation. "Not guilty," the foreman announced, his voice steady and clear. A collective gasp echoed through the courtroom. Silas was acquitted of all charges, a free man. The judge, it was later rumored, had a personal history that bore striking similarities to Silas's situation, a betrayal in his own life that had left deep scars. Perhaps this had influenced his decision to allow the defense's arguments to stand. Silas sat in stunned silence as the verdict was read, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The relief was overwhelming, but it was tempered by the knowledge that nothing would ever truly be the same again. His life, his family, his reputation, they were all in ruins. The aftermath of the trial was a whirlwind of media coverage and public scrutiny. Silas knew that he couldn't stay in Fairfield. The town that had once been his kingdom was now a place of painful memories and shattered illusions. He sold the mansion, liquidated his assets, and made arrangements for Emily and Lucas to stay with their grandparents in a different state. The children, still young and innocent, had been shielded from most of the horrific details of the events, but they understood that their lives had changed forever. Silas knew they needed a fresh start, away from the shadows of the past. Silas himself became a ghost of the man he once was. The drive, the ambition, the confidence that had defined him were gone, replaced by a quiet, haunting emptiness. He moved to a small, nondescript town far from Fairfield, where no one knew his name or his story. He lived alone in a modest house, spending his days in solitude, trying to come to terms with what he had done. The media eventually moved on to other stories, and the public's fascination with the Mitchell case faded with time. But for those who had been close to the family, the scars remained. The townspeople of Fairfield whispered about the tragedy for years, each retelling of the story adding new layers of speculation and myth. In the quiet of his new life, Silas often found himself thinking about Brianna. Despite everything, he still loved her in his own way, and the pain of losing her, of losing the life they had built together, was a constant ache. He thought about the choices he had made, the moments of anger and jealousy that had led him down a path of no return. He wondered if there had been another way away to save his family without resorting to violence. But those questions had no answers, only echoes that haunted him in the dead of night. In Fairfield, the old church where Father Sean had served for so many years became a symbol of the town's darkest chapter. Attendance dwindled, and eventually the church was closed and the building sold. It was converted into a community center, but the memories of what had happened there lingered in the minds of the townspeople. The community struggled to reconcile the image of Father Sean, the kind, gentle priest they had known for so long, with the man who had harbored such dark secrets. Some tried to move on, to forget, while others couldn't help but feel a lingering sense of betrayal, not just by the priest, but by the church that had protected him. As for Brianna, her legacy as a talented ballet dancer was overshadowed by the scandal of her affair. Her performances were no longer remembered for their beauty and grace, but for the tragedy that followed. The dance academy where she had trained and taught eventually removed her name from their records, hoping to distance themselves from the scandal. Yet, despite the efforts to erase her memory, those who had known her couldn't forget. Some pitied her, others judged her. but all agreed that she had been a woman caught in a web of circumstances that had spiraled out of control. Her story became a cautionary tale, whispered among the young women of Fairfield as a reminder of the dangers of temptation and the fragility of even the most seemingly perfect lives. Years passed, and Silas's life of self-imposed exile continued. He rarely spoke to anyone, his days blending into one another in a monotonous routine of solitude. He had become a man without a purpose, living only because he had no choice. The wealth he had once enjoyed now meant nothing to him, and he gave most of it away, keeping only what was necessary for a simple life. He would receive letters from his children. Emily and Lucas, now teenagers, were doing their best to move on with their lives. They were cared for by their grandparents, who provided them with a stable home and all the love they needed. The letters were filled with stories of school, friends, and everyday life. But there was always an undercurrent of pain, a reminder that they, too, were struggling to make sense of what had happened. Silas read each letter carefully, often responding with words of encouragement and love, but he knew that his relationship with his children would never be the same. They visited him occasionally, their meetings awkward and strained, the shadow of the past always looming over them. Silas tried to be the father they needed, but the guilt and shame he carried made it difficult for him to connect with them as he once had. Could Silas have prevented the tragedy that shattered his life? Was Brianna's choice to seek solace in an affair with Father Sean a catalyst for the disaster that followed, or merely a symptom of the deeper fractures in their marriage? These questions would haunt him for the rest of his days, a constant reminder of what he had lost and what he could never regain. Thank you for joining us in exploring this harrowing tale of love, betrayal, and consequences. But this is just one of the many stories we unravel here on Soralaw, where we delve into the mysteries that keep you on the edge of your seat and reveal the chilling truths that lie beneath the surface. If this story gripped you, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another episode. In our next video, we'll explore a case where a seemingly ordinary man leads a double life, hiding a dark secret that, when exposed, left an entire town in shock. Stay curious, stay safe, and we'll see you in the next episode. Remember, with Soralaw, the truth is always stranger than fiction.